the Rocketeer finally got a huge buff, really increasing its DPS in value, nearly doubling its DPS at max level. In this video, I'm going to be showcasing all the stat changes, values, and uses of this tower and give my personal ranking of how good it is. So, hit that like button and subscribe, and let's get started. At level 0, its placement cost went from 2,500 to 2,000, its splash damage doubled from 20 to 40, its explosion range decreased from 4 to 2.5, and its DPS went from 3.99 to 7.99. At level 1, its total cost went from 2,800 to 2,300, its splash damage doubled from 20 to 40, its explosion range decreased from 4 to 2.5, and its DPS went from 4.99 to 9.98. At level 2, its total cost went from 3,600 to 3,550, its splash damage increased from 50 to 70, its explosion range decreased from 4 to 3.5, and its DPS went from 12.48 to 17.47. At level 3, its total cost went from 10,100 to 9,050, its splash damage increased from 90 to 135, its explosion range decreased from 5 to 3.5, and its DPS went from 25.66 to 38.48. Finally, at level 4, its total cost went from 28,100 to 27,050, its splash damage increased from 225 to 275, its fire rate decreased from 3.758 to 3.008, its explosion range decreased from 6 to 4, and its DPS went from 59.87 to 91.42. Pretty much every single stat in this tower was immensely buffed, being overall cheaper and dealing significantly more DPS. The only thing that was nerfed was the size of the explosions, but this isn't that big of a deal. The Rocketeer is meant to be a mix between a crowd control and single target DPS tower, so it makes sense that they reduced the size of the explosions. At level 0, its price was reduced by 500, and its DPS was basically doubled, improving its value from 1.6 to 4 DPS per 1k spent. That's a huge difference. It means the Rocketeer is much better in the early to mid game than it used to be. But I say the biggest improvement comes in the later levels, especially when maxed out. It got a DPS increase of 31.55, now having an impressive 91.42 DPS. On top of that, its total price was reduced by 1,050 cash, improving its value from 2.13 to 3.38. That's still not super high, but you can't forget that this tower also deals splash damage. Even if we only assume it's hitting 2 enemies per shot, that gives it an average DPS of 182.84. That's a value of 6.76, which is much better. Still, this isn't nearly as much as something like the mortar can get, which I'd argue is still much better against crowds of enemies. If we assume it's hitting 4 enemies per shot, that gives the mortar a DPS of 456.12 and a value of 13.18. Also, the Rocketeer still has the issue of its dead zone, which makes finding a good spot for it a bit troublesome. But fortunately, it has insane range at max level, which does help counteract this. There are 3 benefits from using the Rocketeer. First of all, it has slightly better single target DPS for its price than the mortar, with the mortar having 3.3 value at max level and the Rocketeer having 3.38. That's not a huge difference, but the biggest advantage the Rocketeer has is its placement limit. You can only place 4 mortars, while you can place up to 8 Rocketeers. That means you can get significantly more DPS out of the Rocketeer, with 8 max Rocketeers giving a total of 731.36 DPS and having an average of 1,462.72 DPS against crowds. The mortar is still a bit better against crowds, with 4 of them averaging roughly 1,824.48 DPS, but they can only get 456.12 DPS against a singular target. On top of this, the Rocketeer can be placed anywhere on the map, while mortars can only be placed on cliffs. When playing with others, you'll notice that you quickly run out of good spots to place cliff towers, so this makes the Rocketeer a bit easier to use and spam. And finally, the Rocketeer gets hidden detection after level 2, but the mortar never does. However, the mortar does have flying detection, so which one is better kind of depends on which game mode you're playing. Overall, I say the mortar is still better, but the Rocketeer is now a pretty great tower. I'm going to rank it as a low A tier, since it can do some fantastic damage against mid and late game crowds and is objectively better against bosses. However, it does face some serious competition from the mortar, and the dead zone is pretty annoying. But let me know in the comments how you guys would rank this tower and whether or not this was a good rebalance. And if you enjoyed, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to join the Blue Head Mafia. Also, if you want to talk to me, consider checking out my Discord. We got some pretty cool features, like a custom party finder bot that will automatically pair you up with other people who are trying to do the same strategy. There's a link to the server pinned in the comments. And finally, I want to give a huge shout out to these channel members for supporting my content. If you want to add me as a friend on Roblox or get early access to some of my videos, consider becoming a channel member. It helps me out a lot and I really appreciate it. Anyways, that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.